Marjorie was 16, African American, and quietly settled in first class on a crisp early morning flight to Los Angeles. The cabin shone with polished walnut accents and soft golden lighting, but in an instant everything changed. As she sat in seat 2A by the window, dressed smartly in a navy sweater tucked into high-waisted cream trousers, a hulking security guard abruptly seized her arm and dragged her from her seat with the force of a sudden winter gust. "This isn't your kind of seat," he declared with a sneer, his tone cold and dismissive as if her very presence there was a mistake. The other passengers simply looked on in stunned silence. Some even pointed their cameras, their expressions a cocktail of smirks and whispers as they secretly murmured about how she must have tried to sneak into a place where she didn't belong. Marjorie, whose new name, chosen to mark her rebirth away from humiliation, now echoed with strength and dignity, held her head high despite the unfair assault on her self-respect. Without a scream or a plea, she rose with a calm determination, brushing the wrinkles out of her coat as if erasing the memory of that painful moment. In that moment, a silent promise was made. The humiliation she endured was just the beginning of a challenge that would topple the corrupt status quo. What if the girl they so carelessly demeaned actually possessed the power to unravel an empire built on prejudice and old habits? The terminal, abuzz with the early hum of flight announcements and the scent of freshly brewed coffee, suddenly became the stage for a collision of worlds. At gate C-24, while others scurried about with half-finished lattes and sleepy eyes, Marjorie, firm in her stance and resolute in her dignity, waited her turn to board her flight. Her ticket to first class was clutched in her left hand and her passport securely held in her right. Every detail of her poised composure, from the way she sat as if following the time-honored lessons taught by her beloved grandmother, to the quiet confidence in her eyes as she gazed out at the bustling tarmac, became emblematic of the unyielding spirit of someone who had faced injustice before and was ready to meet it head-on. But the deeply entrenched prejudice in that very air was palpable. A man in a finely tailored gray suit exchanged a murmur with his wife, speculating aloud that she must be a minor traveling on a discount pass, his words dripping with assumption and a disdain reserved for those who did not fit his narrow view of who belonged in first-class luxury. When Marjorie's boarding pass was finally scanned, the gate agent offered a smile that seemed too forced, too calculated to hide the skepticism brewing in her mind. Yet Marjorie simply said thank you and moved forward, her steps unhurried and resolute, setting the stage for what was to come. Inside the aircraft, the luxurious first-class cabin filled with whispered judgments and sideways glances, Marjorie settled in her seat by the window. Across the aisle, a well-dressed man returned his gaze to his tablet, indifferent, while a woman 2 rows back exchanged quiet, disdainful remarks with her neighbor. Marjorie, however, focused on her phone, sending a loving message to her father that read, "Boarded, thank you for the seat. Love you," only to set the phone face down on the tray, as if signaling that today, too, she would rise above the fray of bigotry. The tense atmosphere thickened as the flight's final boarding announcement resonated throughout the cabin. A gentleman in 4C summoned a flight attendant, pointing discreetly but forcefully in Marjorie's direction. "Is she really supposed to be there?" he demanded, his tone laced with incredulity, as if he couldn't fathom how a young black girl could ever have earned such privilege. The flight attendant checked her tablet, her eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty even as she confirmed the legitimacy of Marjorie's seat. Though no passenger dared openly challenge the authority in the room, the murmurs and stares proved that prejudice was the true order of the day. Amid the tension, a TSA officer named Trent, a tall, broad-shouldered white man with a stiff jaw, made his way down the aisle, his eyes hard and scrutinizing. As he approached Marjorie's row, all eyes followed. "Miss, I need to see your boarding pass," he said, in a tone that brooked no refusal. Marjorie, poised and unruffled, replied in a measured voice, "Is something wrong?" With a quiet calm that belied the storm inside her, she produced her pass and handed it over. Trent's eyes darted back and forth between her and the boarding pass, his suspicion growing as he questioned the validity of her presence. "Step into the aisle," he ordered, his voice growing louder, attracting rising phone cameras and recording devices from fellow passengers. Standing slowly and with resolute dignity, Marjorie watched as Trent carelessly snatched her carry-on bag from beneath her seat, letting her personal journal spill onto the carpet, a journal that chronicled not only her thoughts but also the struggles and small victories of a lifetime marked by discrimination. The scattered pages were left in a disregard that echoed the callousness of those who believed she did not deserve her rightful place in luxury. Leading her out of the plane, Trent declared that the resolution would be dealt with off the aircraft, a phrase that rang with the hollow promise of retribution that was still to come. Beyond the jet bridge, the tension escalated as a second agent awaited her. He quietly directed her to a row of cold metal chairs along the wall, discarding her bag at her feet as if her presence were a temporary inconvenience until the so-called ticket discrepancy could be resolved. Marjorie's heart pounded like a drum in a quiet revolution as she sat, the chill of the metal biting through her clothes while her mind plotted the course of the coming reckoning. As she waited, her phone buzzed with a message from her father, anxiously asking, "Did you take off yet? I'm tracking the flight." With a trembling calm, she typed back, "Not yet. They pulled me off the plane." Her words a quiet admission of the injustice unfolding before her, while also hinting at a fury that would not be contained for long. Nearby, the murmurs grew louder. One voice, sharp and disdainful, declared that perhaps she had found the seat in the trash, while another muttered that she was merely trying to game the system. The crew, initially complicit in this display of bias, now began to look troubled as their smug expressions shifted to ones of shame and confusion. In an abrupt twist, a senior official named David, whose authority within the airline was well known, stepped in. With a steely glare and unwavering resolve, he turned to his colleagues and proclaimed that removing a confirmed first-class passenger out of prejudice was not only a mistake, it was a disaster waiting to explode into full-blown legal and corporate ruin. David swiftly pulled up Marjorie's manifest, ticket verification, and internal clearances on his tablet, confirming that every detail of her booking was impeccable. Yet, the damage was done. A disparaging remark from an older flight coordinator named Paul Withers, who coldly stated, "There's no way a black kid just buys a seat like that," left no room for ambiguity regarding the deep-seated racism permeating the establishment. The comment, broadcast inadvertently by a nearby smartphone, was met with a mixture of gasps and disapproving glances from the gathered passengers. Marjorie's eyes flared with a quiet, scorching intensity as she locked onto Paul, silently promising that such cruelty would not stand unchallenged. The situation reached a boiling point when two uniformed police officers entered the scene. One of them stepped forward, asking, "Are you Ms. Bennett?" Despite the new name that represented her transformation into a symbol of resistance, she hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "Yes," she replied with a clear, unwavering tone. David interjected, revealing the crucial secret that changed everything. Her father owned the airline. This revelation was the turning point, a clarion call that would launch an unstoppable wave of justice and retribution. As passengers shifted uncomfortably and whispers morphed into accusatory murmurs, it became apparent that the seeds of revenge had been sown. What had begun as an act of unprovoked discrimination was about to blossom into a full-scale challenge to the airline's corrupt ways. The incident had transformed from a simple case of misconduct into an epic showdown where the underestimated, the oppressed, and the wronged would rise in a magnificent display of retributive justice. It was a tale where every whispered injustice, every snide remark about her ability to belong in first class, and every dismissive gesture would eventually culminate in a magnificent undoing of the preconceived hierarchies. An undoing that promised to leave onlookers both awestruck and inspired. Marjorie, through her stoic resilience and the unwavering support of her influential family, was poised to strike back in a manner so dramatic and public that it would force the entire industry to reckon with its long-standing biases. In that moment, as she sat on those cold metal chairs with her dignity momentarily dislodged yet far from defeated, the air around her began to vibrate with the possibility of a revolution. A revolution where justice, truth, and a powerful sense of retribution would shine through, forever altering the lives of those who had dared to undermine her worth. This was not merely a story about a seat on an airplane. It was a story about the sheer force of spirit and the inevitable triumph of those who have been marginalized for far too long. A story that would echo in every boarding lane and every first-class cabin. A story that would remind every onlooker that sometimes the very people you dismiss hold the power to upend an entire world order with an elegance and ferocity that leaves even the most entrenched prejudice trembling in its wake. Marjorie's phone buzzed again, interrupting the charged silence with a message from her father. It read, "I'm in the boardroom. Do not move. We're initiating corporate protocol in 5 minutes. Stay calm." With a measured composure that defied the humiliation and pain she had already endured, Marjorie locked her phone screen, lifted her head, and met the gaze of one of the officers. "Am I free to return to my seat now?" she asked calmly, her voice betraying none of the storm raging inside. The female officer glanced at her partner, and after a reluctant, heavy nodding gesture from the man, Marjorie turned to David. "Should I reboard?" she inquired softly. "Not yet," David replied, his tone leaving little room for discussion. "They're cleaning a seat." At that, Marjorie raised an eyebrow in quiet disbelief as she retraced her steps along the jet bridge, escorted by a Nordsky executive and trailed by the same stern security officer who had earlier dragged her out. The entire atmosphere was charged with a heavier than usual energy, a mix of denial and contrived reparations, attempting to mask the systemic inequities at play. When Marjorie finally stepped into the first-class cabin for a second time, it was as if the silence itself had been shattered. Every conversation in the cabin paused mid-sentence. Phones remained raised, capturing every moment, and a few passengers awkwardly looked away, hoping to avoid being dragged into the scandal. Others, completely indifferent or perhaps complicit in the system, pretended nothing had happened. Marjorie made her way to her newly prepared seat, 2A, which had been cleaned and freshly fluffed in an effort to restore an illusion of hospitality that hoped to erase the glaring humiliation she had suffered. But before she could settle in, the same stern-faced security officer, Officer Trent, reached out abruptly and snatched her tote bag from the armrest, as if to remind her that she was still under suspicion in the eyes of those who governed this biased domain. "This is yours," he said in a rough tone as he yanked the bag off the armrest, eliciting a slow nod of reluctant acceptance from Marjorie. "Yes, it was under the seat," she murmured, her voice carefully measured despite the hurt bubbling up inside her. Before she could complete her sentence, Trent callously dropped the bag onto the floor in the aisle. "Take it with you next time you try to section," he muttered, his words dripping with venom and a disdain that cut deeper than any physical blow. Marjorie's eyes locked onto the bag, now carelessly flopped sideways with its zipper half open, allowing small items such as a tube of lip balm, a few pens, her boarding pass, and fragments of her personal honor to spill out in disarray. For several long moments, she did not bend down to retrieve her belongings. Instead, she turned her gaze onto Trent, her tone steady as she declared, "I did not sneak into anything. I boarded with a scan ticket like everyone else." Trent merely smirked in return, as if his derisive expression validated every prejudice he held, before striding away with boots that thudded ominously along the carpet, a sound that punctuated his cruelty more effectively than any apology never uttered. Marjorie eventually bent down silently, gathering her scattered possessions with a grace that belied the deep emotional wounds within her. Once she resettled in seat 2A, the atmosphere in the cabin was almost tangible with disdain. In a low, almost conspiratorial murmur, A woman seated across the aisle cleared her throat and leaned closer to her husband, whispering so that even those nearby caught every disparaging syllable. "Some people need to learn their place," she said with a bitterness that betrayed decades of ingrained prejudice. Her husband chuckled, adding casually, "They should just be sent to the back and save us all the drama," as if the very idea of an African-American girl in first class was an absurdity that the world simply wasn't meant to witness. For a long while, Marjorie endured the whispered slurs and condescending glances without responding. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and opened a folder containing encrypted documents that her father had prepared for emergencies. With deliberate precision, she began composing a succinct yet scathing email titled, "Formal Record Flight 227 Incident." Each keystroke was a silent testament to her resolve, a calculated move that shunned overt emotion in favor of a steely, corporate bloodletting that she knew would bring those responsible to account. It was an act of rebellion executed with the quiet efficiency that marked her every step, a way to channel her personal pain into a weapon against the institution that had so callously wronged her. As the plane's engines roared softly in preparation for departure, a new flight attendant approached her with an offer of a drink. The attendant paused for just an instant upon seeing her name on the manifest and instinctively adjusted his posture, as if in deference to the gravity of her presence. "Ms. Bennett, can I get you anything?" he asked in a tone that was both tentative and loaded with unspoken apologies. Marjorie, meeting his eyes with a face that remained calm yet unreadable, replied evenly, "No, just make sure your colleagues know who is actually flying the plane next time." The attendant blinked, nodded, and retreated quickly, leaving behind a charged silence that was immediately filled with the murmurs of displeasure from another part of the cabin. Behind him, an older man with thinning blonde hair and business casual attire rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, calling her an entitled brat, a phrase that stung like a lash in an already fraught atmosphere. Marjorie tightened her grip on her tablet and pressed send on her report, her actions as measured as they were vengeful. Not far away, in economy class, a teenage girl with intricately braided hair was scrolling through her phone. Her eyes widened as she stumbled upon a live stream that had just begun to trend with the hashtag Marjorie Bennett. The live broadcast captured every degrading moment, her being pulled from first class, surrounded by a flurry of hostile staff, with onlookers recording the incident and their own derisive commentary echoing through the cabin. The caption read, "CEO's daughter kicked off her own airline's flight." A statement as bitter and ironic as it was untrue, yet it hurt all the same to witness such a cruel misrepresentation. The girl's eyes welled up with tears as she whispered to her mother, "Mom, you need to see this," her voice trembling with a mix of horror and empathy. At the same time, high above the murmurs of discontent in the cabin, the captain of Flight 227 received a terse call from corporate headquarters. "Flight 227, do not engage autopilot until we confirm clearance protocol," the captain was instructed in a clipped, impersonal tone. In the cockpit, he glanced briefly at his co-pilot and sighed, acknowledging that the day's events were set to prolong a flight that was already mired in complications. Meanwhile, back in first class, Marjorie opened her father's live tracking dashboard on her tablet, which allowed her to monitor the passenger manifest, internal crew logs, and the name Trent J. flagged in an ominous red ink. Her father had already taken decisive control over the situation. He had initiated an internal sweep that promised to expose and punish those responsible for every act of prejudice that had marred her boarding. The data streaming in was cold and unyielding, a silent record of accountability that spoke louder than any outburst could, and it emboldened Marjorie to trust that justice, as relentless as the ticking of a clock, was on its way. Yet, even as this unseen wave of corporate retribution gathered momentum, Marjorie's personal assault was far from over. Approximately 15 minutes into the flight, while the plane cruised steadily over Pennsylvania, a flight attendant approached her with an apology card. It was handwritten by the captain himself, a feeble attempt at contrition, and enclosed within it was a gift voucher. The card read, "We regret the misunderstanding and are honored to have you aboard," a message that was meant to soothe but instead only deepened the sense of irony. Marjorie stared at the card for a long, pained moment before slowly folding it shut. The gesture of regret was shallow and hardly touched the core of the injustice she had experienced, a mere band-aid for a wound that demanded more than a token apology. Regret was easy, but earning genuine respect was a far greater challenge, one that Marjorie was determined to see through. As the flight continued and the tension simmered in every corner of first class, a woman who had earlier ridiculed Marjorie leaned over once more. "So, what's it like being the token success story?" she sneered with feigned curiosity that masked her contempt. Marjorie finally turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting the woman's with a piercing calm that challenged the very notion of entitlement. "I don't need to be your story," she replied evenly, "and I'm not here to entertain your comfort." The woman's face paled, and her husband shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware that his careless remarks had triggered a backlash beyond his control. Yet, while some passengers might have expected a defensive outburst, Marjorie returned to her tablet without missing a beat, continuing to compile her report. Every glance directed at her seemed to stoke an inner fire. Every whispered remark fueled her determination to transform humiliation into an unforgettable act of retributive justice. With the departure process nearing completion, the cabin's atmosphere became heavier, charged with the weight of visible and invisible confrontations. About an hour into the flight, as the attendants began to distribute the pre-ordered meals, a new development unfolded that further underscored the deep divisions at play. One of the attendants, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and immaculate lipstick, her name tag reading C. Lambert in clear, bold letters, approached Marjorie with a practiced, unnervingly pleasant smile. "Miss Bennett," she began in a tone that dripped with false courtesy, "I've been instructed to ask you to come with me to the forward galley. There's been a discrepancy regarding the passenger report that corporate wants to clarify." Marjorie paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the underlying threat masked by the word clarify. She asked slowly, deliberately, "Am I being asked or ordered?" Her words, though calm, carried a firmness that left little room for misinterpretation. Lambert's response was measured and chillingly condescending. "It would be best if you cooperated," she said coolly, adding that failure to do so would force them to alert airport security upon landing. Every detail of the interaction reeked of intimidation, and with a quick glance around the cabin to note that every eye was now discreetly, or not so discreetly, fixed on her, Marjorie stood up, gathered her tablet, and followed Lambert as she led her toward the galley door adjacent to the cockpit. The door opened with a mechanical whoosh, and Marjorie stepped inside, only to find that the space was not what she had expected from a typical galley. Instead, she entered a makeshift holding area, a repurposed crew rest space that was dimly lit, sealed off by a soft clicking magnetic lock, and tainted by the lingering odor of cleaning agents and industrial steel. A single collapsible seat lined one wall, and the room was stripped of any windows or outlets that might offer a view of the outside or a connection to the bustling world she'd just left behind. Lambert did not follow her in, leaving Marjorie alone in that stark, isolating room as the door closed behind her with an echo that resonated like a final judgment. For several agonizing minutes, no one spoke as Marjorie sat on the cold floor, her posture as straight as ever, a defiant act of resistance against the degradation that had reduced her to a pawn in a far larger power play. Then, without warning, the intercom crackled to life. "For security reasons, we need you to stay here while we verify some inconsistencies with your boarding profile," the disembodied voice announced in a tone that was rehearsed, cold, and altogether devoid of any empathy. It was not an apology, and it was certainly not a request for understanding. It was an imposition that underscored her isolation and the systemic suppression of her rights. Marjorie pressed her lips together tightly as she listened, knowing that every minute spent in that barren holding cell was another minute of her dignity being questioned and her rightful place in first class being denied. She reached for her phone repeatedly, only to be met with the bleak reality of no signal and an unresponsive airplane mode. Every tap on the crew call button yielding nothing but frustrating silence. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and just when the crushing weight of isolation began to feel unbearable, the door finally opened a crack. Not much, just enough for Lambert to reappear, this time holding a clipboard and a cup of water she never offered. "We're still working to confirm your status," Lambert said flatly, her voice void of any warmth or kindness. "You'll remain here until we land in Los Angeles and someone from airport control will assist you further." Marjorie's eyes flashed with a mixture of indignation and sorrow as she asked quietly, "Am I under suspicion of something? Because this feels a lot like detainment." Lambert shrugged, her expression turning almost dismissive as she replied in a tone as cold and calculated as the steel that enclosed Marjorie. "You are not under arrest, but you are restricted from interacting with the rest of the cabin until we can confirm your intentions on this flight." Marjorie's brow furrowed at the term intentions, a word that implied doubt not only of her actions but of her very character. In that moment, every fiber of her being screamed that this was not merely a procedural check. It was an attempt to break her spirit and assert control over a young woman who had already been subjected to too much cruelty. Before the door could close again, Lambert paused, her voice suddenly laced with venomous condescension as she added, "You might be better off flying with your parents next time. First class is a little advanced for unaccompanied minors with entitlement issues." With that cutting remark, she left Marjorie to the oppressive solitude of the room, the door locking behind her with a final, resounding click that echoed the closure of any hope for immediate justice. Marjorie exhaled slowly, her hand reaching instinctively for her pocket only to find her phone still useless. A stark reminder that even in this age of digital connectivity, she was being deliberately isolated and silenced. Left alone in the dim, claustrophobic space, Marjorie scanned the room carefully. There were no cameras, no windows to the wider world, no ventilation fan to even whisper the sounds of freedom. There was nothing but isolation, time, and the cold, hard reality of a system that prized conformity over justice. With every passing second, her sense of injustice morphed into a simmering determination. Here she was, a young woman with a wronged past and a defiant present, confined in a makeshift cell within an airline that prided itself on luxury but was built on a rotten foundation of prejudice. Every minute ticking by in that stifling confinement only reinforced the urgency of her need to expose the systemic injustice, not merely for herself, but for every soul who had been marginalized by an unyielding system. In the silence of that room, Marjorie's mind raced with plans of retaliation that were as calculated as they were deeply personal, each memory of the earlier affronts. Being forcibly removed, having her belongings tossed carelessly on the floor, enduring the slanderous whispers of indifferent passengers, melded together into a potent cocktail of sorrow, indignation, and a burning desire for vindication. She recalled every scornful comment, every suspicious glance, every casual remark that dehumanized her. And though her body was confined within a space designed to strip her of hope, her spirit soared with the fierce promise of retribution. It was not enough for her to simply exist in defiance of injustice. She was determined to ensure that the entire world would bear witness to the downfall of those who believe themselves invincible through prejudice. The isolation became an unlikely crucible in which her resolve was tempered. Marjorie began to map out the intricate web of connections within the airline, the layers of corruption that had allowed discrimination to fester unchecked, and the names of those at the highest levels who had orchestrated this travesty. Each detail on her tablet, each encrypted file shared by her father, became a weapon in her arsenal. And even though she was physically restricted from interacting with the rest of the cabin, her inner world was expanding. preparing a counterstrike that would not only disrupt the established order, but would also leave an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of those who had once looked down on her. The journey toward Los Angeles was no longer simply a matter of travel. It had evolved into a battlefield where every moment of humiliation was now a battlement in her quest for justice. Marjorie knew that when the plane finally landed, the controversy would erupt far beyond the confines of that luxurious cabin. The public was already aware. The hashtag trending on social media was a clarion call that demanded accountability, and the internal sweep initiated by her father was well on its way to exposing the rot at the heart of Nordsky's corporate machinery. As she sat in that enforced solitude, the boundaries between victim and victor began to blur. The isolation, meant to break her, was instead solidifying her into a force that would not be tamed. Time passed slowly in that soundproof room, the only clues to the outside world the muffled announcements over the intercom and the occasional creak of the aircraft settling into flight. Marjorie's thoughts churned continuously. She reflected on the cold cruelty of Officer Trent's words, on the disdainful laughter of the passengers, and on the shallow apology card that was as empty as the promises of reformation made by those in power. Every negative interaction, every snide remark was etched in her memory, serving as a solemn vow that she would one day see every perpetrator held accountable. The very same system that had tried to silence her by stripping away her dignity would soon be forced to reckon with the power of the truth she was meticulously gathering. And then, as if on cue, the door finally opened and a small group of executives, led by David, stepped into the holding area. Their expressions were a mixture of contrition and steely determination, but none carried the warmth of genuine remorse. David's eyes, however, held a promise that was unequivocal. This entire debacle would soon be met with an uncompromising reckoning. In hushed tones, they discussed the details of the situation and made plans to handle the aftermath as soon as they regained control over the unfolding crisis. For Marjorie, this was the catalyst she needed. The wheels of retribution had been set in motion, and nothing could halt the avalanche of accountability that was about to be unleashed. The taste of injustice was bitter, yet it fueled her resolve to transform humiliation into a display of magnificent, public vindication. The remainder of the flight became an intricate dance of calculated silence and restrained fury. By the time the announcements confirmed that the plane was preparing to land in Los Angeles, every member of the Nordsky executive response team had begun implementing measures to ensure that the incident was recorded in full detail, not only internally, but for the global audience that had already taken notice. The stage was set for an unprecedented wave of retribution, one that would turn the tables on those who had believed themselves untouchable by prejudice and bureaucracy. When the wheels finally touched down on American soil, the aftermath was nothing short of explosive. As the passengers disembarked, the live feeds and social media exploded with the narrative of an airline in crisis, a system that had attempted to marginalize a young woman, only to have her rise like a phoenix from the ashes of injustice. Marjorie, her demeanor unbowed despite the isolating confinement, stepped forward with the calm assurance of someone who had long since embraced the mantle of her own destiny. Her father's corporate sweep had already isolated the culpable names and exposed the systemic racism embedded in every level of the organization. And as the story unfolded in real time, it was clear that this was more than a personal vendetta. It was a public reckoning, a showdown between the forces of bigotry and the indomitable spirit of those who dared to challenge it. In the ensuing weeks, news outlets across the nation picked up the story. Headlines blared the scandal of an airline that had not only humiliated a young African-American passenger, but had actively attempted to silence her in a space designed for elegance and privilege. Testimonies poured in from brave whistleblowers within the company, and social media trends forced even the most skeptical observers to confront the truth of systemic injustice in modern corporate America. Marjorie's carefully drafted email and the detailed encrypted files became the cornerstone evidence in a lawsuit that promised to reshape the policies and practices of the airline industry for generations to come. The corporate response, initially designed to contain the incident, backfired spectacularly, sparking public outcry and demands for sweeping reforms. It was a power shift that no one had anticipated, one that left the perpetrators exposed and forever haunted by the consequences of their cruelty. Reflecting on those long, agonizing hours in the holding cell, Marjorie realized that her enforced isolation had been the crucible that transformed her pain into an implacable weapon of justice. Every cold minute had steeled her resolve. Every heartless remark had deepened her commitment to ensure that the world would see the true cost of prejudice. With her dignity restored and her position strengthened by the support of an entire community demanding accountability, Marjorie emerged not as a victim, but as a vindictive force, an embodiment of righteous retribution that would echo in every boardroom and every first-class cabin where discrimination still dared to hide behind the veneer of luxury. And so, with the scandal now in full view and the wheels of justice turning inexorably, Marjorie prepared for the final act of her grand counteroffensive. In a public statement delivered with the calm gravity of one who had endured the worst and risen above it, she declared that no one, no matter how high their station or how deeply entrenched their prejudices, would ever again be allowed to strip away the dignity of an individual. Her words resonated across news networks, social media feeds, and coffee tables across the country. For too long, the powerful had wielded their authority to oppress the vulnerable, but now the tide had turned. Marjorie's transformation from a silenced passenger into the architect of a sweeping, public redemption was complete. A redemption that forced every onlooker to confront their own complicity and demand a future where justice was not a privilege reserved for the few. In the aftermath, Marjorie's story became a rallying cry. Her experience was dissected on talk shows and discussed in community centers, each retelling amplifying the narrative of resilience against systemic abuse. For many older women across the nation, women who had witnessed decades of discrimination and bureaucratic indifference, her stand became a beacon of hope, a testament to the fact that even in the face of unyielding adversity, the human spirit could triumph with style, grace, and an unbreakable will. Marjorie's journey from the cold, echoing confines of a repurposed crew rest area to the glare of public vindication captured the essence of a struggle that had spanned generations. It illustrated that when injustice is met with the full force of accountability and collective outrage, even the mightiest systems built on old prejudices can be brought to their knees in a display of staggering retribution. As the nation rallied behind her, calls for systemic change reverberated from coast to coast. Lawsuits were filed, corporate boards restructured, and the airline industry was forced into a long overdue period of self-examination. Marjorie's steadfast determination, as exemplified in every painstakingly recorded document and every carefully chosen word of defiance, proved that justice was not a matter of chance. It was a responsibility owed to every person who had ever been marginalized. And in that historic moment, when the scales of justice began to tip irrevocably in her favor, Marjorie stood not as a solitary figure of defiance, but as the representative of every victim whose silent pleas had been drowned out by the roar of indifference. In the months that followed, as the legal battles unfolded and the corporate machinations crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny, Marjorie's legacy was cemented as a symbol of persistent resistance. The very same airline that once sought to humiliate her was now forced to confront its own failures, and the echoes of her triumphant rebuttal resonated in every statement, every policy change, and every reform that swept through the industry. Her story, told and retold in boardrooms, dinner conversations, and heartfelt speeches at community gatherings, became a definitive reminder that the path to true equality was paved with the courage to challenge injustice at every turn. And so, while Marjorie continued to rebuild her life with the dignity that had always been rightfully hers, The incident aboard Flight 227 ignited a broader conversation, a conversation about race, power, and the inescapable need to stand up for what is right. Her experience, marked by unspeakable cruelty and countered by a fierce drive for justice, has become a timeless example of how one person's resilience can reshape an institution and inspire an entire nation. In the final analysis, Marjorie's ordeal was not just a personal trial, but an event that captured the collective conscience of a society tired of hidden injustices and secret abuses of power. It was a pivotal moment when the vulnerability of a young woman, stripped of her dignity in a first-class cabin meant to be a sanctuary of comfort, became the spark that set off an avalanche of change. With every public apology, every corporate shakeup, and every reform promised, the echoes of that plane incident continue to remind us that no one is too insignificant to challenge the mighty. Marjorie's courageous journey stands as a vivid lesson in the transformative power of standing up against prejudice, a lesson that resonates particularly with those who have seen the cost of discrimination all too clearly over the decades. In recounting this dramatic saga to a community of experienced women who have long battled their own challenges, it is impossible not to be moved by the strength of a spirit that refused to be broken. Marjorie's story is a story of hope, a story of meticulous retribution, and above all, a story of vindication. It is a narrative that demands that we look at our society with unflinching eyes, recognize the injustice that once seemed tolerated, and join together in the belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And as the winds of change begin to blow through even the most established institutions, one cannot help but feel an electrifying mix of admiration and hope. A hope that one day, no one will have to endure the kind of degrading treatment that Marjorie once did. Ultimately, the tale of Marjorie's defiant stand aboard Flight 227 is not merely an account of a singular event, but rather a clarion call to every individual who has ever been diminished by prejudice. In the echo of every whispered remark and in the silence of every ignored call for justice, her story reminds us that the fight for equality is perpetual, that every act of injustice carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, and that every moment of suffering can be transformed into a catalyst for monumental change. This, indeed, is the legacy of Marjorie, a legacy that will undoubtedly resonate for generations to come and serve as an enduring inspiration to all who believe in the unyielding power of truth, dignity, and relentless retribution. Marjorie knew that time itself could be weaponized when wielded by the wrong hands. Leaning her head back against the cool wall of the holding room, she closed her eyes for just a moment and recalled her father's words from when she was 8 years old. He had told her, "If they ever make you feel small, remember who you are. Then remind them." And she could feel the silent descent building not only in her heart, but within her entire psyche. At long last, as the plane finally docked and the door hissed open, a female ground agent stepped inside and called, "Miss Bennett, please come with us." Marjorie said nothing, and instead walked out past the cockpit, past the flight attendant, who now refused to meet her eyes, and past the same officer who had once callously dumped her bag, now standing with his arms folded as if daring her to speak. With her head held high in steadfast defiance, she moved toward the jet bridge. Waiting there was a small, stern group of North Sky Airport staff, dressed in suits that appeared more like battle armor than ordinary uniforms. Among them, a bald, clean-shaven man in his early 50s with a clipped badge reading C. Rhodes, Senior Terminal Manager, stepped forward and extended his hand in a gesture of formal apology that Marjorie did not need to accept. He stated, "Ms. Bennett, my name is Charles Rhodes, and on behalf of our company, we sincerely apologize for the confusion during your flight. We would like to clear things up quickly and professionally." Marjorie gave him no reaction, no word of thanks. Her expression an unreadable mask of sorrow, tempered by fierce determination. Rhodes motioned toward a side hallway, saying, If you will follow us, we have a quiet area where we can talk away from the public eye." His tone, although polite, carried a hint of condescension that Marjorie could not ignore. She followed him, flanked by 2 other staffers, down a narrow corridor marked for authorized access only. At the end of the corridor was a small, sterile room with a table, 2 chairs, and a mounted camera that one of the staffers promptly disabled before Marjorie entered. The room was cold and impersonal, its walls stark as they bore silent testimony to the systemic injustice that had unfolded earlier. Marjorie sat down, her eyes never leaving Rhodes as he pulled out a slim file and began to speak in an artificially warm tone. He said, "So, here is what we are trying to do. There has been a bit of confusion surrounding your flight and some irregularities with the boarding system. We believe that a software issue flagged your name, triggering a cascade of automated responses that led to the unfortunate treatment you received." Marjorie raised one eyebrow and replied evenly, "A cascade of racism, is it?" Rhodes continued without missing a beat, sliding a printed document across the table. "What we would like to do is log this as an internal error. No individual will be blamed, just a procedural glitch. If you agree to this settlement, we will provide immediate compensation, priority travel upgrades for 1 year, and a formal letter of apology signed by the regional vice president." Marjorie did not even touch the paper, her voice cold when she said, "So, you are asking me to pretend that this never happened?" Rhodes exhaled slowly as he attempted to persuade her further. "We are asking you to help us prevent an escalation, because once something like this goes public, it cannot be controlled. They will twist it and weaponize it against you. You will be portrayed as angry, difficult, and undeserving, regardless of your age. That is not the image you want." Marjorie fixed him with a stare that could have frozen molten steel. "I am not worried about my image. I am worried about setting a precedent. And I am not prepared to back down." Rhodes leaned in, his voice softening as he said, "I am offering you a way out." Marjorie smiled, a smile that made even seasoned executives second-guess their footing. As she stood, pushed the unsigned document back across the table, and declared, "My legal team will be in touch." Rhodes hesitated briefly before glancing at a staffer by the door, who gave him a subtle nod. Moments later, in a secure server room 3 floors above, a junior technician named Bradley Chan received an urgent instruction via an internal message. His orders were chilling. Purge all footage from Gates C-18 and JetBridge D, with timestamps from 905 to 1020, and tag it as corrupted file recovery. Bradley hesitated, knowing that those orders were not standard procedure, yet the instruction was marked confidential with VP approval, leaving him no choice but to act. He executed the deletion in under 3 minutes, locking down the process in case of any future audit. But what he did not know, and none of them did, was that Marjorie's father had anticipated every move. Victor Bennett had implemented a redundancy protocol 3 years ago. Any incident involving a family member on North Sky Properties would automatically trigger a remote sync to an external legal archive in Geneva. The sync had begun the moment her boarding pass was scanned, preserving every second of video, every line of system metadata, and every racial slur in an unerasable record of truth. Marjorie's story reached a climax that stunned everyone involved in the wake of the incident. One particular clip sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of the airline's leadership. Audio captured from a crew radio revealed Malcolm Reese, the head of global security operations, laughing cruelly as he mocked her. He said in a tone dripping with disdain that she believed she was untouchable simply because her father owned a few planes. He added that she was merely a child occupying a seat she never truly earned, and that no one would ever take her seriously. That moment of callous amusement froze the room in silence until Marjorie's father, Victor Bennett, finally spoke up with authority, declaring, "You are all about to take her seriously." Legal officers exchanged horrified glances. The head of HR wiped his forehead with a napkin. and the VP of PR looked as though she might vomit. Someone whispered frantically that they needed to get ahead of this disaster, but Victor's voice cut through the panic, saying bluntly, "You are already behind." With that, he left the room in a purposeful stride that sent a message to every corner of the company. At Nordsky's headquarters, Malcolm Reese was alone in his corner office, savoring a glass of scotch when his phone lit up with a direct call from the chairman of the board. Malcolm allowed the phone to ring twice before answering in his customary casual tone. "Reese here?" However, the voice on the other end was icy and unyielding. The chairman ordered him to turn on channel 4 immediately. Malcolm picked up the remote and switched on the wall mount screen, and what appeared before him drained the color from his face. It was not only Marjorie's story that was trending, it had become the story of the year. Breaking news banners crawled relentlessly across CNN, MSNBC, and major international outlets. Headlines screamed, "Airline CEO's daughter targeted in a first-class incident," "Nordsky faces federal inquiry into racial discrimination," and "Evidence exposes a systemic culture of profiling among the flight crews." A leaked internal email chain flashed across the screen, in which several employees, including Malcolm himself, discussed strategies to contain escalation and manage optics in racially sensitive situations. One chilling line read, "Keep any minority VIPs quiet until we confirm they belong." Malcolm's name was printed in the footer of every message. The chairman's cold order came next. "Pack your things, you are done." Malcolm stood frozen, with his scotch glass trembling in his hand, when he protested, asking, "You cannot be serious." The chairman replied, "I am not, and it is Victor Bennett who is." Malcolm's world had suddenly toppled as his career and credibility hung in the balance. On social media, the hashtag evolved into #ZaraGate, but Marjorie, no longer a victim of mere misfortune but the face of a battle for dignity, had said nothing publicly. Her silent stance only amplified the uproar online. Tens of thousands of users flooded Nordsky's pages, and high-profile figures, celebrities, politicians, and activists united in demanding transparency, reparations, and the resignation of those responsible. Meanwhile, Marjorie sat alone in her father's private study, surrounded by the quiet that belied the raging storm outside. The weight of the previous 24 hours had not yet fully settled upon her, for she was already plotting her next move. The truth, she knew, had only just begun to surface, and while the world scrambled to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred, she was already 10 steps ahead in her pursuit of justice. Her phone buzzed incessantly with alerts. One message from a trusted contact inside Nordsky's scheduling division read, "Inbound flights frozen. Maintenance code G7 issued to the entire fleet." That single message was a bombshell. Within exactly 62 minutes of her forced removal from the terminal, a nationwide system flag had been triggered in the company's proprietary flight control algorithm. This algorithm, equipped with a non-negotiable override from the highest levels of ownership, immediately ordered every domestic and international flight operated by Nordsky, over 280 aircraft, to be grounded, under the pretext of a technical recalibration review. The real reason, of course, never reached public memos, but every boardroom, private Slack channel, and encrypted email chain within the airline knew the truth. Victor Bennett had pulled the emergency brake on an empire built on biased practices, and he had done it without uttering a single word on camera. Almost simultaneously, every major news channel in the country interjected breaking news with red banner headlines proclaiming that the airline's ownership was tied to a viral discrimination scandal. The headlines identified the CEO's daughter as the passenger who had been targeted in a vicious episode, and a formal statement from the FAA followed minutes later. Although officials claimed that no technical threats had been identified, the statement confirmed that the airline's internal systems were under emergency review at the owner's behest. Confusion reigned among the public, but behind closed doors in corporate offices, a chilling truth set in. The girl they had tried to silence and humiliate had, in fact, wielded the power to shut down the entire first-class operation. Within Nordsky's global headquarters, chaos reigned. Executives scrambled desperately to issue press releases, but they were halted by legal counsel who insisted that no statement be released until the board could convene. That board meeting, however, was now being chaired not by the acting CEO, but by Victor Bennett himself. Utilizing an emergency clause in the company's operating charter, Victor had overridden executive authority to protect the integrity of his family's legacy. In a dramatic meeting, Victor stood at the head of the table as directors and officers sweated under his stern gaze. His voice resonated with a mix of righteous anger and steely resolve as he declared, "Gentlemen, I built this airline on trust, dignity, and performance. In the last 24 hours, each of those pillars has been violated. Not by isolated missteps, but by an entire culture of prejudice that you allowed to fester." With a commanding gesture, he directed everyone's attention toward a screen displaying time-stamped footage of Marjorie being forcibly escorted off the plane. "This," he said, "is your legacy. Now, we are going to erase it and write a new one." When the CFO timidly raised the point that grounding the entire fleet would cost hundreds of millions per day, Victor interrupted sharply, "Losses are easier to recover from than integrity. I would rather see our company bleed cash than lose credibility." Without delay, he ordered the immediate termination of every individual implicated in the chain of discrimination and failure. Trent, Lambert, Withers, Reese, and more. No severance, no secret non-disclosure agreements. He demanded complete transparency and instructed the legal department to audit every escalated passenger incident over the last 5 years. If they found any patterns of abuse, he insisted the company confess before the evidence could be used against them. Across town, in a secure, soundproof studio, Marjorie prepared for her moment on the public stage. Instead of a staged interview, she opted for a live stream that was raw, unscripted, and unfiltered. With one decisive click, the video began broadcasting across every major platform. Within minutes, it was embedded on news sites, reshared by influential voices, and translated into 6 languages. Her voice was not that of a victim. It was resolute and unapologetic as she explained, "I was not dragged off a plane by accident because of a system error. I was removed because someone looked at me and decided I did not belong. And then, a system designed to protect their own interests attempted to cover up the truth. I do belong, not just because my father owns this airline, but because every single person deserves the respect they have earned." Her message cut through the cacophony of media reports like a clarion call, and her steady, unwavering tone resonated deeply with everyone who had ever been marginalized. While the digital world erupted with outrage, Victor Bennett himself was not one to shy away from crisis. At exactly 6 p.m. Eastern Time, he stepped into the studio of a major national network. Dressed in a tailored black suit, with the Norska insignia shining on his lapel, he faced the camera with an intensity that silenced the room. The anchor asked him if he was prepared to address the scandal publicly, and his reply was calm and deliberate. "I am not here merely to address the incident. I am here to end it," he continued. "No one touches my daughter and walks away as if nothing happened. And this is not just about her. It is about every person who has ever been told they do not belong in a place they have earned through hard work and determination." His statement was raw and unscripted, and it lit a fire that no boardroom could ever extinguish. Within minutes of his broadcast, the Justice Department, in collaboration with the FAA and the Department of Transportation, released a joint bulletin confirming a formal investigation into Nordsky Airlines and its subsidiaries. They cited long-standing complaints of discriminatory practices, unfair passenger profiling, and the deliberate manipulation of internal documentation to suppress complaints. Simultaneously, an anonymous whistleblower leaked over 2,000 internal HR reports detailing cases of racial targeting, false accusations, and wrongful terminations that spanned more than a decade. Every document, every recording, and every testimony painted a damning portrait of an institution built on the exclusion of those who did not conform to a narrow standard. Marjorie, now a trusted advisor to an independent ethics panel, pored over these files with a calm determination. She did not react with outrage. She simply noted each injustice, each instance of abuse, and prepared to see that every perpetrator was held accountable. In that moment, her struggle had become a beacon for justice, a testament to the power of truth in the face of systemic corruption. And so, as the world watched with bated breath, Marjorie stepped forward not as a defeated victim, but as the embodiment of a new standard of accountability. Her unwavering stand against prejudice and the monstrous forces that sought to silence her had set in motion a revolution in the very foundations of the airline industry. A revolution that promised a future where dignity and respect were no longer negotiable. Marjorie's resolve was unbreakable, and she vowed in that moment, with fire in her eyes, "I won't leave until I've rebuilt the system." As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the rotten core of the airline was exposed, and dozens of department heads began tendering their resignations, fearing the full brunt of the backlash. Yet not everyone was allowed to exit gracefully. A senior vice president of security, the very man responsible for authorizing illegal data wipes, including the deliberate deletion of footage that captured Marjorie's humiliating removal, was arrested and indicted on charges of obstruction of justice. Another executive, whose signature had sealed non-disclosure agreements designed to silence wrongfully dismissed employees, was named in a class action lawsuit demanding more than $700 million, 0 cents, in damages. Public support for Marjorie and the truth only grew louder. Across airports, in cities from coast to coast, protesters rallied with handmade signs reading, "We fly with truth, and seats don't have color." Prominent celebrities proudly sported shirts emblazoned with her defiant words, "I'm not here to entertain your comfort." And activists, along with legal experts, hailed that fateful moment as a turning point not just for North Sky but for corporate America as a whole. Transparency was no longer a gentle request. It had become an unyielding demand for accountability. Victor Bennett, once known as a quiet magnate who preferred to remain behind the scenes, had transformed into a corporate general, leading a reckoning amid what resembled a modern war. The morning after the federal probe had been made public, North Sky's headquarters in New York looked less like a stately corporate bastion and more like a battle zone. Satellite vans parked around the front gates, reporters jostled for position outside the glass doors, and anxious shareholders paced on the sidewalks, their smartphones lighting up with reports of billions vanishing from the company's valuation in real time. Inside the boardroom, an ominous silence prevailed. Not because decisions had already been hammered out, but because no one dared make the first move. At exactly 8:32 IEM, Victor Bennett strode in, flanked by his stern legal chief and steadfast ethics counsel, carrying a leather-bound binder that would soon become the most consequential document in North Sky's 32-year history. Without uttering pleasantries or making any small talk, he placed the binder squarely on the table and flipped it open to a marked page. Within the next 2 hours, security teams escorted 12 more senior personnel out of their offices. Some left in stunned disbelief, while others did so in silent resignation, their eyes downcast as their professional futures crumbled around them. IT teams locked their accounts, froze internal communications, and flagged every device suspected of compromised integrity for further investigation. By noon, the press had acquired names, photographs, and a detailed timeline that could not be ignored. By 2 p.m., North Sky's stock had plummeted 48%, wiping out over $4 billion, 0 cents, in valuation overnight, and sending shockwaves through the international aviation market. Banks began to pull their preferred lending rates, and foreign partners swiftly withdrew all co-share agreements, signaling that no one wanted to be associated with a company whose reputation had been so irreversibly tarnished. A prominent investor based in the United Arab Emirates released a scathing statement denouncing North Sky's ethical failures and announced immediate divestment. Several private equity groups, once eager to partner with North Sky on ambitious global expansion deals, now publicly disassociated themselves from the brand. The damage was not merely financial, it was deeply reputational, forever branding every seat that Marjorie had been unjustly denied as a symbol of a cost that the company could no longer ignore. In response, North Sky activated its crisis protocol, but this time, Victor Bennett rewrote the script. He ordered that all marketing expenditures be frozen immediately. Every scheduled advertisement was abruptly replaced with a stark black screen that bore a simple, powerful message in white letters: "We failed. Now we fix." Furthermore, he directed the finance team to reallocate the executive bonus reserves toward a restitution fund aimed at compensating past victims of discrimination within the company. Then Victor did something unprecedented. He publicly welcomed former employees to submit their claims and testimonies for investigation, assuring them that they would receive full whistleblower protection even if they had previously signed non-disclosure agreements. This move stunned the entire industry and shifted the power dynamics completely. At a closed-door summit attended by representatives of the Department of Transportation, the Federal Aviation Administration, and noted civil rights watchdogs, Victor laid out a sweeping reform framework designed to set entirely new standards for the aviation industry. He announced that mandatory bias training would be implemented not only for flight crews but for every corporate employee. Third-party audits of all passenger incident logs would be required, and a federally maintained registry of discrimination claims against commercial airlines would be established. The plan was as radical as it was aggressive, met with both enthusiastic applause and cautious skepticism, but none could dispute its clear intent. Meanwhile, those whose careers had been destroyed by the scandal sought desperately to salvage what little remained of their legacies. Malcolm Reese, once the arrogant head of global security who had mocked Marjorie behind the scenes, gave a brief interview claiming he had merely been following orders and attributing the misdeeds to a vague culture of corporate fear. The internet was having none of it. Social media platforms looped his leak comments, "No one's going to take her seriously," over and over, while protesters congregated outside his home. Book deals vanished, speaking engagements were canceled, and the man who once strutted through corporate hallways with an air of invincibility now found himself unable to enter even a local grocery store without drawing stares of contempt. Claudia Lambert, the flight attendant responsible for locking Marjorie in the galley, soon faced formal misconduct charges from the aviation union. Her pilot's license was suspended pending investigation. Though she issued a written apology, critics unanimously decried it as nothing more than a superficial performance designed to deflect deeper accountability. A class action lawsuit citing her behavior as emblematic of frontline racial profiling in commercial aviation named her as one of the main culprits behind the systemic injustice. In less than 72 hours, those who had once wielded unbridled power at North Sky were reduced to mere footnotes in a sweeping company-wide reckoning. Claudia Lambert, after facing suspension and union investigation, retreated from the public eye. Few knew she had returned to her hometown in Indiana, where her parents lived in a humble neighborhood outside Bloomington. For several weeks, she refused to answer calls or engage with old social media posts, choosing instead to listen to the unfiltered playback of the entire incident. When she finally watched the raw footage and saw herself, the unvarnished truth of her behavior, it brought her to tears for 2 long hours. That day, she made a decision. She called the ethics line set up by North Sky and declared, "I want to be part of the training program, not to teach, but to learn, and if given the opportunity to apologize." Months later, she rejoined North Sky not as flight staff, but as a peer mentor in their new restorative conduct initiative, beginning every session with the simple, heartfelt sentence, "I almost destroyed a life because I was too proud to question my own assumptions." Across town, Malcolm Reese, whose arrogance once defined his career, was forced to confront his own demons. Stripped of his accolades and now living in a modest house 2 hours north of Atlanta, he began therapy for the first time. He discovered that what he had long mistaken for strength was nothing more than fear. Fear of appearing weak, of being wrong, of losing power. Under the gentle guidance of his therapist and the persistent urging of his daughter, he eventually began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that worked with at-risk youth. Now, he leads workshops on accountability, opening each session with the line, "My legacy used to be built on making people afraid of me. Now, I build it by helping them not be afraid of themselves." Others who had looked the other way also found their paths to accountability. Paul Withers, the aging flight coordinator who once sneered that no black girl could afford first class, chose to retire early and relocate to Nevada. There, he began working at a small local airport, loading bags and refueling planes by choice rather than compulsion. He took the brave step of writing personal apology letters to every former colleague he had once belittled. One of these letters, shared online, touched thousands, as he wrote, "I don't ask to be forgiven, but I do ask to be better than I was yesterday." Marjorie's unwavering stand and the sweeping reforms that followed became more than just a story of retribution. They ignited hope throughout an industry long mired in prejudice. Her journey from a silenced, humiliated passenger to a revered advocate for justice was a reminder to all that every act of discrimination carries a cost too high to be ignored. And as the system was rebuilt from the ashes of its former self, Marjorie's legacy shone as a beacon of resilience, proving beyond doubt that true transformation is possible when one has the courage to demand dignity and fairness for every human being. Marjorie's remarkable journey culminated in a transformation that rippled across the entire airline industry. In a stunning display of accountability and reform, North Sky Airlines held equity summits in partnership with leading civil rights organizations. In perhaps the most symbolic gesture of change, the company proudly renamed its flagship diversity program the Marjorie Standard. This new name stood as a powerful reminder that every individual deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter their background. The announcement reverberated across boardrooms and community centers alike, a resounding acknowledgement that the era of systemic injustice had come to an end. Victor Bennett did not attend the unveiling ceremony in person. Instead, he watched the transformative moment unfold from afar with a quiet pride and a sense of peace that only comes after a hard-fought battle. He had taken immense risks, pulled every lever at his disposal, and burned down every barrier of prejudice to protect the dignity of one extraordinary young woman. In doing so, he had redefined what it meant to treat thousands of passengers as human beings, rather than mere figures on a manifest. At the center of this incredible change was Marjorie, a girl who had once been told without a trace of compassion that she did not belong in her seat. Now, with steely determination and unyielding resilience, she had become the very person who decided where every seat was placed and who deserved to occupy them. In the wake of the scandal and the subsequent corporate reckoning, protesters filled airports nationwide, holding up signs that proclaimed, "We fly with truth," and "Seats do not have color." Celebrities donned shirts emblazoned with Marjorie's defiant words, "I am not here to entertain your comfort." Across social media, the public's outcry urged for accountability and demanded that every act of discrimination be exposed. Marjorie's voice, once stifled by hateful assumptions and institutional racism, now echoed across every major platform. Her silence in the face of injustice had transformed into a resounding call for reform, a call that could no longer be ignored. The changes at North Sky Airlines were not solely about rebranding or public relations. They were about deep, fundamental reform. Victor Bennett's decisive actions had led to the dismissal of corrupt executives, the arrest of those responsible for illegal data wipes, and the dismantling of policies that had long protected systemic abuse. The company's stock had plummeted and billions in valuation evaporated, but amid that financial storm, true accountability was restored. Former employees took up roles in the new Restorative Conduct Initiative, even those who had once contributed to the oppressive system, like the disgraced head of security and the flight attendant who had locked Marjorie in the galley, were compelled to face the consequences of their actions. Now, as Marjorie sat back and reflected on her journey from humiliation to empowerment, she found that her strength had redefined an entire industry. Her legacy was no longer tied to a single incident, but had become a beacon for justice and transformation. Her story reminds us all that when discrimination is challenged head-on, when every act of injustice is met with unapologetic retribution and heartfelt reform, the world can change. What part of Marjorie's journey hit you the hardest? If you were in her seat, what would you have done? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and share where you are watching from. Your voice matters, and together we can shape a future where dignity and respect are the only standards that matter.